Honorable Armitage, fellow general officers, nearly 80 returning Army War College alumni, ladies and gentlemen in the class of 2012, and all of those who are out there on closed circuit and streaming video around the world. Good morning, great to see you, and welcome to the U.S. Army War College's 23rd Annual Strategy Conference, and this is the largest ever in history. Hooah! Way to go, SSI, good job. A special thanks to the Army War College Foundation for their support to this and many other Army War College activities. It's great to see this engaged audience representing a wide variety of backgrounds, career fields, and academic disciplines. Like I said last night during the welcome, this is a great opportunity not only to learn, but to dialogue, to network, to make new friends, and strengthen old friends. This is a great mix of loyal supporters from previous years and new members to our community of interest, focusing on the contributions that land power makes to the nation's security. And a way to think about land power is really the human domain, the domain of human beings who live on land and then how we influence them. To the class of 2012, and you have less than 2 months to go. And I talked to you a couple weeks ago, and it was a little bit over 2 months. And again, man, make every day count. And I would encourage you to participate in this great conference as much as your schedule will allow. Avail yourself of the opportunity you'll have over the next 2 days to hear these assessments of many different experts regarding U.S. national strategy, what it should be as our nation moves forward from wartime into a new era of fiscal austerity. By the way, for the conference participants who are from out of town, the number of IFs, International Fellows, is doubling from a historic number of 40, typically to 80 next year. So lots of international participation. For the conferees, get to know our students. They truly are our credentials here at the U.S. Army War College. History. This day in 1898, U.S. President William McKinley asked Congress for a declaration of war with Spain. So why does that matter at the U.S. Army War College? It was out of the fiasco of the administration of the war with Spain that the Secretary of Defense, Secretary of War, was fired, and Elihu Root was asked to come in. And Elihu Root was a tremendous strategic leader for our nation, our armed forces, our Army, and through his leadership, he put a number of reforms forward that later historians called the Root reforms. But the first thing that he did was the establishment of the U.S. Army War College on that day, his first year in office. Root went on to be the Secretary of State and win the Nobel Peace Prize, but he really is the founding father of this U.S. Army War College, and everything we do reflects the vision and the wisdom of Root. So just something to think about here as we start this conference off. This conference series is the Army's flagship strategy conference, and it's put on by our Strategic Studies Institute on behalf of the United States Army. And I want to acknowledge and thank SSI and the gentlemen who have put this conference on. Very, very well done. Thank you very much. And so the big idea is to facilitate the ideas between scholars, national security strategists, and military practitioners on subjects of mutual interest, and to further edify and expand land power's community of interest in the larger national security community. So again, like we talked about last night, the big idea is this conference, we're going to advance the body of knowledge and create new knowledge. This 23rd annual conference's topic is very, very significant. Our U.S. strategy must adapt to dynamic change in the international and the national environment. Several reasons come immediately to mind when you think about it. Worldwide economic pressures demonstrated by a weak U.S. economy and severe pressure on the European Union member states. The concluding, in the next couple years, of 2 decade-long wars, and new and expanding challenges around the globe and opportunities with events such as the so-called Arab Spring. The realization of the tremendous significance of the cyber dimension of security, the shifting of U.S. security focus to the Asia-Pacific region, increased concerns over the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, and the perceived changing role of the United States in the global community of nations. Those are just a few points that I would mention, but there's many more. This conference, in the title, The Future of U.S. Grand Strategy in an Age of Austerity, offers an excellent opportunity to contribute to the development of a national narrative by examining the changing security environment, offering various alternative grand strategy options to deal with it, and analyzing the implications of the environment and various strategies on the military, other government departments and agencies, and the development of leaders needed to formulate and implement the strategies. And that's really our core competency at the U.S. Army War College, why we exist, to develop and educate leaders who can serve at that strategic level. Meanwhile, we got to do all this knowing that we've got our most precious resource, America's sons and daughters, in combat today. And here at the War College with our leaders, we are always thinking about that every day and with our coalition partners. But literally, we know today in Afghanistan, up on the folks living on the knife's edge, as the spring fighting season starts and fighters are flowing in, we got our greatest national treasures, America's sons and daughters, out in harm's way. So we owe it to them to have a wise, effective strategy so that we preserve and advance our most precious resource. And to just kind of highlight that, all of you know people who are in the military serving overseas, but we as generals, we have coins, and that's pretty cool. We get to make these cool coins. Young troops don't have coins, but they do have their unit crest. And so a young sergeant who's with a Special Forces unit today, literally out on the tip, gave me this and said, hey, I know you guys are going to do good by us. You're the smart guys. We're counting on you to get it right. So we owe it to them, and I know you're going to take that seriously here at this conference. But thinking about ends, ways, and means, our ends are not going down. Our means are going down. We must come up with new, creative, innovative ways to advance our nation's security. And that's what this conference is really all about. So with that, we are extremely fortunate to have today the perfect keynote speaker to get us started on this exciting two-day journey. And the gentleman to my left, what an awesome haircut, huh? So, as with our other speakers and panelists, you can find his complete bio in the conference pamphlet, but just let me say, this Boston native has been there and done that on many levels, from the tactical to the strategic. He has been those boots on the ground with 3 combat tours in Vietnam with riverine and advisory forces. He's fluent in Vietnamese and versed in many other languages. He is an avid athlete and weightlifter. He was over in the gym early this morning. We probably need to get more weights over there to challenge his workout. He played football. He was a linebacker at the United States Naval Academy with his teammate Roger Staubach. His government service includes congressional staff time, foreign policy advisor, special emissary, ambassador, assistant secretary of defense, and deputy secretary of state. He also has held key positions in the private sector as a consultant, international import-export businessman, board of directors and lobbyist, chairman of a non-governmental organization, the American Turkish Council, and many others. His many successes validate both his intellect and his leadership capacity, and his insights reflect a long career in many critical national security positions that have enabled him to form a comprehensive perspective of the challenges and opportunities with which our national security community must grapple. I cannot think of a more qualified speaker to set the foundation for this conference with his keynote presentation, which is entitled America's Role in a 21st Century World. Please join me in extending a strong and hearty U.S. Army War College welcome to the Honorable Richard Armitage.
Very nice. Thank you, sir. Well done. Thank you. Thank you. Commandant, thank you very much for your kind words. See if you still think that when I'm finished today. I hope that'll be the case. Delighted to be back in your AO. I used to be up here a lot when I was in government, and in between when I was an unemployed Republican, as I am now, back during the Clinton years. I used to come up here quite a bit. I've always enjoyed it. I've enjoyed the interaction with the students. I want to particularly say hello and a thanks to our foreign students who are here today. You will, as the Commandant indicated, greatly enrich the discussions here at the college. And one time years ago, and let me say hello to Jim Locker and Dr. Larry Korb, who colleagues of mine from the Department of Defense. I feel right at home here, so nice to see you, and for the former colleagues, hello to you as well. In my relatively short and sort of speckled military career, I once had to learn how to jump out of airplanes. Many of you were wearing the jump wings. Some of you are master blasters. I thought it was a very unnatural act, but I went through the course and did my job. And the reason I got through the course was because I thought of a great musician hero of mine, a great guitarist, perhaps in my view, the leading guitarist of the rock and roll era. Anybody know who I'm talking about? Let me give you a hint. Soldier of the 82nd Airborne, Jimi Hendrix. And Jimi Hendrix was a soldier with the 82nd Airborne. Well, Jimi Hendrix, if he could do it, I could do it, I figured. He has one of his many songs, something called All Along the Watchtower. This was written by Bob Dylan, actually. But All Along the Watchtower has a verse in it that says, you know, there are people here among us who think that life is but a joke. But you and I aren't down with that. That is not our fate. Let us not speak falsely now. The hour is getting late. So when I'm through up here today, you may or may not agree with me in part, in whole, or totally disagree. You can do all of the above. But I trust that at the end of this, you will say, he didn't speak falsely to us. Now I'm going to wander around. I think I'm mic'd up. Is that working? I'm one of these folks who's a textual deviant. I can't use a text. Say it carefully, please, or you'll hurt my reputation even more. So these talks are as big an adventure for me as it is perhaps for you all. Now, a friend of mine from Singapore, some of you may know his name, is Ambassador Kishore Mahbubani. Kishore was the Singaporean ambassador to the UN at one time. He's now the dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Administration. Well, he's a guy who likes to break a lot of crockery, and he does. And he, in the wake of all the Arab Spring activities, he gave a speech. It was quite provocative, and his speech basically said, all around the world, dictators are dying and democracies are failing. Now, he was engaging in a bit of hyperbole. As the only dying dictator was Gaddafi. Mr. Mubarak, President Mubarak, was ill, but he was just having some fun. And democracies are having some difficulties. I'm not sure they're quite failing. But he went on to say something that's quite interesting, at least to me. He said, the reason dictators are dying and democracies are failing is because politicians and dictators all do the same thing. They lie to their public. Dictators lie to the public by telling them how good they have it. They lie to themselves by saying how much the public loves them and how great they are. Well, this is not unknown in Western democracies. Look at Europe. You mentioned the difficulties in Europe, Commandant. The whole notion of the European Union was built on a lie. Fiscal independence and monetary union. Now, how do you put those two together? Fiscal independence and monetary union. Well, they were going to do it by having fiscal discipline. Never let the debt exceed 3% of GDP. Everybody knew it was a lie. It was not going to happen. And by the way, this phenomenon is not unknown in our own country. How many politicians have stood up in front of you and told you, you're going to have to sacrifice. We're going to have to do something about our taxes, at a minimum, close some of the loopholes, and we're going to have to rein in our out-of-control spending. You're going to have to sacrifice. No, that's not very popular. They're not going to tell you that. They'll tell you that recovery's right around the corner, better days are here, just hold on. We can do it without raising taxes or closing loopholes, et cetera. It's not true. People are smarter than that. And I think we're in, at least here in the United States, in a period of some flux. Our democracy's changing. We'll get out of this. I have no question. I'll finish with some words about where we are as the United States. Commandant, you mentioned the focus of the administration now on Asia. Well, this is tinged with a tiny bit of controversy. Secretary Clinton said, we're back in Asia. Fact of the matter is, we never left Asia, and she's since acknowledged that. And Asia, among all regions of the world, has not been subject to partisan pressures. It's been a pretty bipartisan approach to Asian policy. They've also, the administration says they're going to pivot in Asia. Well, they don't use that term anymore either because it's too aggressive. But they do use a term which I mightily approve of, and that's we're going to rebalance with Asia. And we're going to rebalance out of two wars, and we're also going to rebalance within Asia from total, almost complete focus on Northeast Asia, for obvious reasons, to a spread-out focus over ASEAN as well as the South Pacific. And that's a pretty good word, rebalance, and I think we're back to where we were with a bipartisan approach to Asian policy, because we all face what I think is the most important thing that's going to occur in the first half of this century. And it's probably as important as the rise of United Germany for you historians in the 19th century, or perhaps rivals the rise of the United States in the 20th century. And that's, of course, the re-rise of China. Now, the administration will tell you it's not about China, but guess what? It's about China. It's about China. And you can't get away from that. It's not negative, but it is about China. And what about China? Now, in a way, this is kind of a naughty thing to say, I guess. You remember 3 or 4 years ago, or 3 years ago, when our president, after a couple months in office, received the Nobel Prize? He got the Nobel Prize for not being George Bush. That's a fact. It occurred to me at the time that someone who really did deserve a Nobel Prize might be Deng Xiaoping of China. Because after all, he had raised 600 million people out of poverty. That's a pretty daunting task. Now, they don't give it to people who've passed. So this is a pipe dream. But it occurred to me at that time that that's a real success story. And we don't want a grumpy, dislocated China. But it is the fact that when a nation rises and existing powers try to accommodate those nations, there are some dislocations of the tectonic plates. I'm not saying the plates are shattered. I'm not looking for trouble. We've got enough trouble. But there are dislocations, whether you're talking the economic plates or the cultural, social, political, or security. And this is what we're wrestling with now in Asia. When our president gets up in the morning, I'm sure he thinks he's got a hell of a tough job. I think he does. He's got a lot of problems on his plate. I think presidents and prime ministers all around the world probably think the same thing. But when the present president of China, Hu Jintao, gets up in the morning, he's got real problems. First among them, and primary, and above all else, is corruption. It's strangling this country, and they're wrestling with it every day. You've got environmental problems, access to fresh water problems. You've got the need to change your economy from an export-driven economy to an internal consumption-led economy. They're not sure they can make the pivot, if I can use that word. They're not sure. They're talking openly about it. If they do make that pivot, that's great for us, it's great for Japan, it's great for almost every country in the world, because our products will be very welcome to the consumers in China. We've got the problem of, so-called problem of ant people. These are people coming from the country to the city, looking for employment, looking for something better. There's not infrastructure to support them. It's difficult for them to get along. It's difficult for them to find jobs. President Obama and the premier of China, Wen Jiabao, about a year and a half ago, had a meeting in Washington. Maybe it was a little longer than that. And President Obama was shaking his head to Wen Jiabao, saying, I got a lot of problems. I got to deal with this Congress, and I got this, and economic problems and all. And Wen Jiabao said, Mr. President, I've got 900 million farmers. I only need 300 million. What am I going to do for those other 600 million? I've got the real problems. And I think he was right. And they've got internal problems now in China. Tibet, Inner Mongolia, Xinjiang. They've had these problems, so divided Syria, they've never had them all at once. And now they've got them all at the same time. So from China's point of view, I think they've really got a difficult road to hoe. But I want to point something out. It would be a lot easier, I think, for them to hoe the road as far as we're concerned if we knew what they stood for and what they were about. And this lack of transparency, political transparency, which we're witnessing in the Bo Xilai incident right now, lack of political transparency, and in security field, which you ladies and gentlemen would know a lot more about than I. Now, Mrs. Clinton in August of 2010 went to Hanoi at the ASEAN Regional Forum. She was terrific, I think. It was a terrific piece of international diplomacy. She marshaled 11 countries to actually stand up to China and say, basically, we demand that you respect freedom of navigation. We demand that you peacefully resolve territorial disputes. And this caused quite a response from the foreign minister of China, but it was really a good thing. And what was Mrs. Clinton trying to do? She's trying to get China to identify how China sees herself in the world. We've all studied about the Treaty of Westphalia, ended the 30 Years' War in which every European state fought against every other European state, it seems. And out of this treaty came the notion of the nation state with sovereignty and identifiable borders and all that. Well, we're all Westphalian nation states. We all believe we have sovereignty. But the sovereignty of the 17th century is different from the sovereignty of the 20th century. We have ceded some of our sovereignty for the global common, for the general good. This is what happens when you have an international airline agreement, or when you coordinate in space shots, things of this nature. So the question before the Chinese leadership and for all of us, I think, is what kind of China, or how does China see herself? See a 17th century Westphalian state or a 20th century willing to give a little for the global common, a term I hate, but a term I like better, the general public good? That question has not been answered, and it may or may not be answered in the upcoming future when the leadership changes. I want to mention very briefly a little bit about the Korean Peninsula, where there's a 100% chance that North Korea is going to fire what they call a rocket. We call a missile. And the terminology is important. They're going to do it. I guarantee it. They cannot not do it. And I believe, and you can see how this pans out, in the not too distant future, they'll have a third nuclear test. As from their point of view, we, the West, have taught the puppy to pee on the rug. We have awarded their misbehavior in the past. How many times have they sold the Yongbyon reactor to us? That's pretty good. So don't go around saying these guys are crazy. They're pretty good. They've played a very low hand, very skillfully and very well. And they believe that there's nothing else we can do to them, because they don't believe we're going to have military force, particularly with 300,000 of our citizens in Seoul and in the environs there. So they're going to fire this missile. And besides, from Kim Jong-un, the new leader of North Korea's point of view, he's going to have the deck reshuffled here pretty soon. He's going to have an election in December for president of Korea, and he can hardly do worse from his point of view than Lee Myung-bak, who's been pretty anti-communist and pretty tough on the North. There are parliamentary elections in Korea today. We'll get a sign of how that's going to go. You can always have an election in Japan the way they've been changing prime ministers in recent years. We've got an election. There's the leadership change, the reinstalling of Putin in March and Xi Jinping in the spring as president of China. So from Kim Jong-un's point of view, he's going to get a new deck. Any one or all of those could be better from his point of view than the present leadership. So there's no reason at all that the North is going to fail to fire this rocket. And besides, they've always said, well, we don't recognize those international sanctions anyway. So, and then they turn around and blame us for not going through with the food deal. These guys are remarkable. Don't sell them short. A little bit about South Korea. I think you've got a Korean officer here. Thank you very much. Perhaps after this course and after I speak a few words about the Republic of Korea, you could privately share your views. Unless you disagree with it, you can stand up here and do it. It will come as a surprise to most Americans, I think, that the management of U.S. Republic of Korean relations has actually been pretty tough. It's been pretty demanding. And the reasons are very complicated. The last 4.5 years with President Lee Myung-bak have been terrific. And although President Lee right now is quite unpopular with his population, I think he's 26% popular or something like that, he's had a pretty good economic run. He's had a pretty good international recognition of the Republic of Korea run, hosting several international summits. But there's so much frustration in Korea. The good news is it's not frustration, which has us at the center for a change. The reason the management of our relations with Korea has been so difficult is because we've got a short memory about history, and I think our Korean friends have a longer memory. We basically would believe that history began in 1950, after we led the police forces the United Nations police forces, to evict the North Vietnamese. Our Korean friends' view of history would begin several hundred years before that and run through from what a Korean point of view is perfidious actions by the United States. My favorite of this is something called the Taft-Katsura Memorandum. Our president, Mr. Roosevelt, sent William Howard Taft to Tokyo in 1905, right after the Treaty of Portsmouth, to negotiate secretly a memorandum with the foreign minister of Japan. This was at a time we had a treaty with the Kingdom of Korea, a treaty of amity, commerce, and they believed security. We had advisors in many of the Treasury and places like that in the late 80s. This treaty was called the Treaty of Cheonbuk. We'd call it the Treaty of Incheon today. Well, we negotiated a memorandum and signed it with the Japanese, which in exchange for Japan's recognition of our sovereignty over Hawaii and the Philippines, something we desperately wanted, we acknowledged their sovereignty over Korea. One thing wrong, we forgot to tell our Korean allies at the time. So history didn't begin in 1950. It began a lot sooner than that. So the management and the historic distrust that has existed has always been a factor in relations until this last presidency of Lee Myung-bak. December, we're going to have a new president, and management of U.S.-Republican relations is going to get more difficult again, guaranteed. Just a quick statement about Japan. They're in doldrums. They're in bad shape because of political constipation, not unlike what we see here. The prime minister, however, is trying to force tax reform through. He's trying to get trade policies through. And the outcome of his endeavors is very important to us, far beyond what benefits might come from a trade agreement or a little stronger economy in Japan if they get tax reform. Japan is our most important ally, and they're the most important because they give us access to their bases. And there it is. A lot of reasons to care about Japan and a strong economy, good democracy for 60 years, strong donor to the international organizations, all of those things, all true. But what matters is they allow us access to those bases so we can effect meaningful security cooperation in Asia. We could not do meaningful security cooperation without those bases. We could have some, but it would be sort of lackadaisical. Now, we've had a change in recent months in the region. Singapore is now going to up the hosting of U.S. naval warships. The Philippines has again granted us access to Subic, something our Navy apparently wants for the ship repair facilities. We don't want a base. In fact, what the mantra of the administration will say, it's places, not bases. That's what we want. We want access to places. And, of course, we have the Marine Corps at Darwin now. We're starting to fall in on Darwin. So we're just trying to have a lot more options as we move forward. ASEAN, 600 million people, a $3 trillion economy. It matters. So a rebalancing to that part of Asia is not only sensible, it's very much in our interest. The trick, however, is going to be to rebalance and not have those countries see themselves as a pawn in a game we're playing with China. And that's not easy. It means we're going to have a full-up relationship, economic, social, cultural, political, and security where it's comfortable with those countries. So it's not an easy diplomatic task, but it's an absolutely necessary task because the one thing that all of the ASEAN countries don't want is to be given a choice between China and the United States. That is not a decision they want to have to face. Very briefly about South Asia. I'm going to tell us a story as well. I think that the Bush administration, which I was a part, left the Obama administration with a very bad lie in Afghanistan. And I think we took our eye off the ball. I'm sorry for this, and we lost a lot of time. We've lost soldiers, whatnot. But we're where we are now. And my view is Afghanistan right now is not worth one more limb. It's not worth it to me. And I'll tell you why. It's not because our soldiers, airmen, sailors, Marines aren't valiant. They do their job. They always have. It's because we have a counterinsurgency strategy. An axiomatic in a counterinsurgency strategy is you can't be better on the battlefield than the government you support. And the government we support is not good enough. Maybe we were unfair to Mr. Karzai originally. We wanted some Jeffersonian democracy when just good enough would have done. I'm sorry. That train's left the station. We're where we are. And now, that doesn't mean we leave tomorrow, in my view, because we're going to be known as well for how we get out and the manner in which we get out. And I think our population, although the polls show that the population, if just asked the question, do you want to get out of Afghanistan, they'll say yes in overwhelming numbers. But if you ask the question with a little more nuance, say, you want to get out of Afghanistan, but if we pull out in a hurried fashion, many civilians will die and many of the gains, particularly for women and education for women, will be lost, the numbers come way down. So how we get out of there is important. It's very important. But I don't think you can have a conversation just about Afghanistan, because I can assure you and will assure you, look you right in the eye and say 25 years from now, there's going to be a nation called Afghanistan. I don't know what it's going to look like, but I can say that. Their neighbor in Pakistan, unfortunately, I can't look you in the eye and say in 25 years, there's going to be a nation like it is today in Pakistan. Notwithstanding the terrific vision of Muhammad Ali Jinnah in 1947, when he wanted to kludge together the Islamic regions as the Indian Empire broke up, it's not possible. Different languages, different ethnicities, different customs, different tribes. It used to be 5 different countries when Bangladesh was East Pakistan, and that was taken care of in the early 70s war with India. And now it's 4, but they're really 4 separate countries. I mean, I don't know how any government can competently manage that situation. So I'm somewhat sympathetic to whether it was a martial law government or civilian government. Where I'm not sympathetic in Pakistan is the following. If you're a citizen of Pakistan, it didn't matter to you if the government was democratically elected or martial law because you saw no benefit. None. No citizen in a village could tell you the difference. They were screwed liberally by the leadership, whether it was martial law or democratically elected. The people of Pakistan are numerous, 188 million or so. Very young, around 20 years of age is the median age. And a people for whom a 2% growth rate, positive growth rate in GDP, is a death sentence. It's a death sentence. So that's not a very hopeful scenario. And I don't really know what to do with Pakistan. I went there in 2009 along with Sandy Berger, and we did a bipartisan study of Afghanistan and Pakistan, and went and saw our commanders and ambassadors both in Pakistan and Afghanistan, went down to Kandahar, did the normal stuff. Perhaps some of you were around then when we were running around. But while in Pakistan, I took it upon myself to call an old counterpart. And I hadn't seen him since the late 80s when I was the Defense Department's Mujahideen watcher. His name is General Beg. Mr. Beg was a former ISI director and later became Chief of Staff of the Army. And I called him up, and he was shocked and identified myself, and he remembered the name, which pleased me, and said I'd like to come by and see him or buy him a cup of coffee. I didn't think he'd want to come to the U.S. Embassy because he's been virulently anti-American. He chairs something called the Friends Foundation. He writes virulently anti-American stuff on his web. I read it every week. It's pretty interesting stuff. After he caught himself, he said, well, do you know where I live? And I said, yes, you live in your same old house. He said, yes. I said, I'll be by. So I passed by, and this house is important. I'll tell you why. And I went in to see him, and he looked around to see if I had any escorts. It was just me, and he said, you're alone? I said, yes, I'm in your house, General. You've got to protect me. And he smiled and had me come in, and we had some tea and whatnot. We started talking, and he said, it's been 20 years since I've talked to an American. I told him there's no wonder, given the stuff he'd been writing about us. But he said, do you mind if I have a fellow join us? And I said, it's your house, sir. Please, whatever you like. So he opened the door, and in stepped a guy who was central casting soldier. 6'4", tall, ramrod straight, long beard, wearing the Afghan pukol. And I knew who it was immediately, though I'd never met him. And you can Google him, but please don't Google it while I'm up here. Wait till I leave. Colonel Imam, I-M-A-N. It's not his real name. That's his nom de guerre. He was the chief trainer for ISI during the Mujahideen period in the Soviet War. And, I mean, he says, and he'll probably say it if you Google him, although I was trained at Fort Bragg, I don't prefer the Green Beret. I prefer the Afghan pukol. And he told me a remarkable story. I think a good part of it was an I.O. attempt against me, and that's fine. But he said, you know, I'm just back from Marja. This was on the eve of our primarily Marine operation in Marja. He said, and you know, you can't get done what you want to get done. And I said, well, what do you mean? He said, well, they know you're coming, and they'll fight you till they don't want to fight you. They'll bury the weapons and move on. And he said, and you'll come in and you'll do whatever you're going to do, but there's no human capital. So unless you, Americans, want to stay there, there's not enough human capital to do what you say you're going to do in Marja. And he was giving me all this, and I'm just taking it in, and had a friendly conversation, but a little pointed on this. And after about an hour, I'd had enough, he'd had enough, and we got up and we said goodbye. Now, I remarked about General Begg's house. It was the same house he lived in when he was Chief of Staff of the Army. Colonel Imam is known as the father of the Taliban. That's what your Google will say, and he is. And all the former Mujahideen know him very well, from Minister Wardak on down. They know him very well. He's a remarkable guy. He's now dead. Extremists in Pakistan killed him. They say he died of a heart attack, but he had been captured at that time. The reason General Begg's house location is important, and the reason I knew where to go, it's directly across the street, 50 meters, not even, from former President Musharraf and President Chief of Staff of the Army, General Kiani's house. It is not conceivable that Colonel Imam, such a figure so well known, is going back and forth to Afghanistan, et cetera, and the Pakistanis not knowing fully about it. It's not credible. And I can't talk about Abbottabad and all that because I have no knowledge, and I don't think the U.S. government has real knowledge about it, but it's passing strange that the father of the Taliban would be visiting with a former ISI director right across the street from General Kiani, and evidently quite an often visitor. So I don't know how we prevail again in Afghanistan unless we can stop the sanctuaries in Pakistan. And one of the difficulties we've had, and I noticed particularly much more when I was out of office than when I was in, it's so easy in our view. Pakistan should get rid of the Haqqani network. It's a terrorist. It's so easy. They ought to do this and ought to do that. If you put on their glasses, though, it's a little different. From their point of view, how many times has the United States divorced them in the military? Again, we've stopped military assistance to Pakistan that many times. 10 years after the Pressler Amendment because of the nuclear development. So from their point of view, there's a little credibility gap on our side. And from their point of view, the Haqqani network, which we view as just the devil itself, has actually been very helpful to Pakistan. It has gotten many of their soldiers back from extremists in Waziristan and places like that. So, again, one of the difficulties we've had, I think, is we're not looking through each other's glasses. I don't think now, though, there's so much water under the dam or under the bridge that looking through each other's glasses is going to do that much good. So it's one of the reasons I want out. Just a quick mention of India, a bipartisanly supported approach to India. The chairman, by the way, of the U.S.-India caucus in the Senate was Hillary Clinton. They're very well organized, the Indian Americans. They're very high-tech. Right after APEC, they're the most organized lobby group. Been very helpful getting the U.S.-Indian relationship moving across the board. One of the difficulties we're having now is the internal problems with India. They're having so much. There's a change, a generational change in political leadership. There's, like in most parts of the world, there's a focus on corruption and income disparities and things of that nature, and it's making them less available to be a partner in some of the great international endeavors. A little bit about Middle East, if I may. I don't know what to call it. Our journalists were calling it the Arab Spring originally, but got a little messy. So spring, maybe that's not appropriate. So some call it the Arab Awakening. Some of our friends, perhaps our friends from UAE or Jordan, could speak about this. That's, in a way, a little insulting to Arabs. They weren't asleep. This was the center of learning for the world at one time, the Middle East, particularly Iraq. Center. So they weren't asleep, but they were something. But I'll tell you what they weren't in Tunisia, and they weren't in Egypt, and they weren't in Libya, and they're not in Syria today. And that is giving this great outcry for democracy. It wasn't about democracy. It was about corruption. It was about lack of opportunity. It's the same things that brought the students into Tiananmen Square in 1989. Corruption and rising food prices. These are what brought people into the street. Why did they go to the street in Tunis? Because a fruit seller got honked off because a policewoman was trying to shake him down, and he'd had enough. It wasn't about democracy. Now, down the list, 3 or 4 or 5, sure, there's a yearning for some self-expression, no question about it. But I think we missed what was going on. It was about corruption. It was about lack of opportunity. Egypt is a good example. Now, in Egypt, if you graduate from college, you're guaranteed a job, and you'll get a job. Well, it might not be a job that actually is suited for what you were trained for, and it might take 3 years for you to get it, but you will get a job. That's not good enough anymore. not in this age of communication, etc. It's just not good enough. Now, the Middle East changes a lot, and the biggest single change I've seen recently, and it's in the wake of the street uprisings in much of the Arab world, has been the rise and ascension of Turkey. Now, those students of history are looking at me saying, oh, Ottoman Turks and Arabs, they hate each other. Well, that may have been historically true. I was in the Gulf about a week and a half ago, and what the Gulfies were telling me was, you know, there's a vacuum in the Middle East. Egypt is gone temporarily and probably for a long time. The U.S. can't fill it because of our dual problem of containing Iran plus our relationship with Israel. Saudi Arabia won't do it. Turkey will. I said, but to my interlocutors in 2 different states, but why Turkey? Historically, you don't get along. The answer was quite simple. They're Sunni Muslim, and they're not Ikhwan. They're not the Brotherhood, the Muslim Brotherhood. So they're filling a void, at least temporarily. That's an amazing new development. Again, you can't talk about the Middle East without Iran. I, like you, have no idea how it's going to come out. I think there's probably about a 50-50 chance that somebody strikes Iran this year. This year. Yesterday, in an Israeli newspaper, which doesn't mean it was accurate by any stretch of the imagination, but there was a report that Bibi Netanyahu had told President Obama when he was here that he wouldn't attack until the fall. I find that unlikely because Mr. Netanyahu, whom I know quite well, is not going to be driven by some lunar calendar to the defense of Israel. He's going to do what he thinks he needs to do to defend Israel when he needs to do it, not because of some celestial movement of the sun and the moon. It's just not going to happen. Now, on Iran, I served there for a year. I was, I didn't have a job. I was Special Forces advisor there for a year, right after Vietnam. And it was a very interesting place for me to serve. On the one hand, I found Persians unbelievably educated, cultured, fun, good-natured, good-humored, one-on-one. But I found that when you'd go into a Persian home, and more than 1 or 2, I've never seen a more ethnocentric people in my life. I trust that for all of you, and certainly for me, Persepolis was 2,500 years ago. For Persians, it's yesterday. They were on that world stage, and they're going to be back on the world stage, they think. And if nuclear weapons, which is not broadly embraced in the public, but nuclear power is, but there's a misunderstanding, I think, in the public. If that's what it takes to be on the world stage, then they may do it. Now, from our point of view, that might be very counterproductive. They say, for instance, in Iran, they say that, you know, we're surrounded by nuclear states. You got India and Pakistan, you got China, Russia, U.S., and Israel. And, well, the obvious rejoinder to, okay, let's accept your point of view, Mr. Persian. You're right. But you're obtaining nuclear weapons, which guarantees that at least Turkey, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia go nuclear. How is that going to improve your lie if you're a golfer? You'll go from 6 to 9 nuclear states around you. It's the only thing I haven't had the Persians come back with an answer yet. They haven't figured that one out yet. But it is a practical question for them, I think. As they are, if they go forward with this weapon, they're going to find themselves with 3 other nuclear neighbors. It's not a good picture, in my view. One thing I can say with 100% assurance, that absent some sort of NEO or something of that sort, or an extraction, you're not going to put boots on the ground in Iran. It's not going to happen. We've known this for a long time. It's just too big, too vast, and if you liked Iraq, you're going to love Iran in terms of distance and geography, and the mountains in the north are unbelievable. So I haven't talked about Russia. I'll save that for the questions. I want to mention something in South America, I think, because it gets back at this whole democracy question. I think President Obama has toned down the rhetoric on democracy, what Mr. Bush used to call, freedom's on the march, we're pushing democracies. Well, you know, there are a lot of democracies around the world we don't particularly like. How about Venezuela? Now, Hugo Chavez was elected cleanly by the majority of his people, and we ought to know because the Bush administration worked hard to get a plebiscite in Venezuela to have a second election, which Hugo Chavez won. He won it. And why did he win? Well, he's a populist. He's taking advantage of the frustration of the Venezuelan people who had had democracy for a number of years and didn't see the benefits. Where were the institutions that were going to deliver the promises of democracy? Where are the party systems that you need to support a democracy? Where's the rule of law and the free press, all these things that you need? Now, it was ripe pickings for a populist. And if a populist wins, what happens? Got a couple choices. They could do the hard and arduous work of developing those institutions, free press, rule of law, etc. But that's really hard work and unpleasant work. Or they can become more and more autocratic, which is exactly what Mr. Morales in Bolivia is doing, what Mr. Chavez is doing in Venezuela. So it leads me to the following. If you're going to have a democracy promotion agenda, then you have to have the preparatory work done. That is to have the framework, the skeletal system on which you can drape the cloak of a democracy. And all those things, party building and free press and all that stuff that you need. Without it, you're almost bound to eventually have a populist accede to the leadership. Now, there's a school of thought, and you read it every day in the United States, that we're in decline. The United States is in decline. And I got to say, if you live in Washington and look around, particularly at the U.S. Congress, you could have that view, and understandably so. I was so relieved to see that Illinois Senator Dick Durbin is finally going to stand up and have a very meaningful hearing to address the difficulties, the challenges that we all face. He's going to have a hearing on the New Orleans Saints and the NFL bounty. Now, that's great. That's great. We can't get taxes. We can't get reform. We can't rein in spending. But Congress can have a hearing on the NFL. Why? They can bloviate to their heart's content. They'll be in front of the cameras because football is popular. And there's no content. It's content-free. This is great. They don't have to take a hit for anything. So I can understand if you live in Washington why you might be susceptible to that argument that we're in decline. Well, this is a Congress. Let me put it into context. Congress is, I think, plumbing the depths of 10% popularity. British Petroleum, the height of the Gulf oil spill, was popular to the tune of 26%. The IRS, 40%. Hugo Chavez, 11% approval rate in the United States. Paris Hilton is more popular than the U.S. Congress. So that kind of tells you all you need to know. But I'm not of that school of American decline. I'm of the school that looks around and says, you know, we've had some tough political times before. We've had fights on the floor of the Senate. We've had the turn of the century of the 1898, 1903 or 4. Nothing was moving. But our system corrects. And that's what's going to happen here. Our system is correcting. And it'll take 2 or 3 terms. And we're going to have to get a lot of these characters out. And people are going to have to come to Congress realizing they came to do something, not to prevent everything. And it'll happen. And this is good. We renew ourselves transparently, and that's a good thing. But if you look more broadly, if you get out of Washington and you go out to anywhere, and you see that local governments are taking the initiative themselves. Local entrepreneurs are stepping out, and they're inventing things, and they're doing things that matter. Look at even our manufacturing. It seems to be enjoying some sort of a renaissance. You know, it's not for no reason that the United States has more Nobel Prize winners than any other country by far, whether you're talking medicine, math, science, philosophy, by far. It's not for no reason that the great centers of learning of the world are primarily, but not exclusively, primarily in the United States of America. This is why we're so lucky to have so many foreign students coming to these great universities. And they're not coming because they're looking at a nation in decline. Now, it is true that relatively, of course, there's been a change. We were here. The rest of the world was here. And now we're like that. China being chief among them, Brazil, Turkey, others are coming up. But there's no question in my mind that we're going to be, for the foreseeable future, for much longer than looking at your ranks and the line facers, much longer than you're going to be in the service, we're going to be dominant. we're going to be dominant, and we will be the dominant and indispensable nation in the world. You know, if you think about it, we've had a terrible time since 2007, 2008 economically. Just ask brothers and sisters who are still out of work. But very frustrating to everyone around the world is, you know, we can do it on our own. It would be ugly and be unattractive, and it sure would be tough. But the United States can do it alone. Europe cannot. The austerity measures have been put in with Spain and Italy and Greece. This is going to continue. I heard, I got to share this line. I think we have some officers from Europe here. I heard an economist who described a new law of economics. He calls it Chancellor Merkel's law of the, let me get this right, of the permanent disappointment. The law of the permanent disappointment. We're all depending on Germany to pull Europe out of this doldrums they find themselves in, support the euro. Well, the law of permanent disappointment that they're ascribing to Angela Merkel is the chancellor will always do more than she promises to do. And the amount of money put forward will always be less than that necessary to solve the problem of the euro for once and for all. The law of permanent disappointment. We don't face that. We're going to make it. When we could even do it by ourselves, it's not the desired way to go. Now I'm going to wrap up. I was asked by the Commandant, since the class has got 2 more months to go, if I had any words of wisdom. Look, all of you far exceeded in your chosen career paths anything that I ever achieved. But I heard something recently that kind of amused me, and then it made me think. Anybody know who Herman Boone is? I asked you earlier. So anybody know who? You actually do know. Remember the Titans? Denzel Washington? That's Herman Boone. Well, Coach Boone was at the Naval Academy about 2 months ago, and I had the opportunity of speaking there with him. And after it was over, I asked Coach Boone, you know, got anything philosophies that's guided your life? This guy's a real hoot. He's a real deal. He said, well, as a matter of fact, there is. And he said, never say anything that you don't think. And never think anything that you're not willing to say at some time. It's pretty damn good. It's really stuck with me. So, look, I'll stop there. I'm supposed to have 40 minutes or 35 minutes for questions and answers, or questions for sure. Whether we have answers, I'm not sure. So let's turn it over to you. Thank you.